When people think of a shadowy figure pulling the strings behind the American government, they usually think of some kind of billionaire or organization of elites. But what if I told you that between the years of 1981 and 1989, that the person with the most influence over the American president was not a member of the Rothschilds, but instead a woman in her mid-50s living in San Francisco? This is the story of Joan Quigley and her influence over the Reagan family. In 1988, Donald Reagan, surprisingly not related at all to Ronald Reagan, despite being his head of staff, decided to write a memoir about what it was like working within the president's inner circle. It is here that we get our first mention of Joan Quigley. In his book, he states that every major move or decision the Reagans made during my time as the White House Chief of Staff was cleared in advance with Joan Quigley, who at the time was referred to as their friend in San Francisco. But who is Joan Quigley, and how did it end up that the president was running all of these decisions past this seemingly random woman? To answer that, I'm going to have to take you back to 1973 to the Merv Griffin show. Now, for those of you who don't know, Merv Griffin at the time was a late night funny man, similar to your Jimmys and Conans of today. On his show, Merv Griffin would have on a variety of guests, and this led to him becoming a very well-connected man. One night, he decided to take on an up-and-coming astrologer who had just taken on several high-profile clients, as well as been doing their rounds on national and local TV. Her name was Joan Quigley. According to Quigley herself, in the memoir she wrote, What Would Joan Say?, which I have read in its entirety, she apparently dazzled Merv with her vast astrological knowledge. She also claimed that she was able to correctly predict that he had just given his son a large sum of money. Merv was so dazzled by her astrological abilities that he asked if he could give her number to the wife of the current California governor, Nancy Reagan. Apparently after this, Nancy Reagan would give Joan Quigley a call somewhat infrequently, usually around once a year. Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan were believers in astrology prior to them meeting Quigley. However, they didn't start running all of their decisions past the stars until Reagan got elected in '81. On March 30th, 1981, a man named John Hinckley Jr. fired several shots at the newly elected president. John Hinckley Jr. had a condition called erotomania, which, if you want to find out more about, you can always watch my mental illness iceberg, in which I covered this condition in greater detail. Erotomania is a condition in which a person believes that someone, usually a celebrity, is deeply in love with them. John Hinckley Jr. had the belief that the actress Jodie Foster was deeply in love with him. He had reportedly seen the movie Taxi Driver 15 times, in which Jodie Foster plays a child prostitute. In the movie Taxi Driver, the protagonist attempts to assassinate a senator. This is important because it led Hinckley to believe that the best way to get Foster's attention was to one-up the protagonist of Taxi Driver and assassinate the newly elected president. Several people were shot during the attack, including the press secretary, a member of the Secret Service, a police officer, and the president himself. While Reagan was trying to enter his car, one of the bullets had ricocheted off it and ended up lodging itself in his lung. However, he did survive the attack. There is no good way to segue into this, but I thought I should mention it, that John Hinckley Jr. is now out of prison. Because the assassination attempt was attributed to a mental condition, and because he's doing a lot better now, he's received the proper care, he was released back in 2016 under a set of strict conditions. And as of 2022, all of those conditions have been lifted. The reason I bring this up is because John Hinckley Jr. has a YouTube channel in which he releases original music.
It makes me feel so good. She's my favorite girl. That is understood.
I hate to say this, but he's not bad. Like, I was expecting it to be way worse than it was. I also think it's funny that because he only has like a handful of followers, out of his followers, it includes people such as myself and the CIA, which I think is very funny. His videos are quite enjoyable. However, you do need to kind of like push that part of your brain down that's asking the question like, how old was Jodie Foster in the movie Taxi Driver? Anyway, he seems like he's been reformed, I guess, as well as if ever there was a person that the federal government was keeping a close eye on, it would be John Hinckley Jr. So I think we're in the clear. Anyway, I thought I would just bring that up, and back to the video. Confronted so directly by your own mortality or the mortality of a loved one can be like a deeply harrowing experience, and it's only natural to become a little superstitious after it. That's why you kind of see people who find religion or some kind of spiritual belief after experiencing like the lowest part of their life. What I think made astrology so appealing to Nancy and Ronald Reagan at the time was the fact that Joan Quigley was essentially saying that she was able to predict the future. Like throughout her book, she constantly states that she is able to predict when bad things are going to happen. Now, this becomes very appealing to someone whose husband has almost just been assassinated. Now, according to Quigley, the first order of business was making Nancy more likable. Immediately after asking Quigley if she was able to predict the assassination attempt, Nancy then asked if Quigley was able to improve the public perception of her, which Quigley said she could. I'll read you an excerpt from Quigley's book after she asked Nancy if she was participating in any charities at the time. I asked her, and the quite predictable answer was yes, the drug rehabilitation program and foster grandparents program. I told her that these two charities would be what she was known for from now on, that she would talk about them whenever granted interviews and make them her personal crusade. She must be a kind, ministering angel of mercy, a sort of supranational mother figure. I told her to set her staff to ferreting out appealing letters from children, for instance, and make a point of answering them. Or she could respond to some needy person, making sure at the same time the story would be well publicized in the media. She was to show how kind she was and how generous and how interested in simple people's problems and needs. The reason I read you this segment is I wanted to show you that even from the start, Quigley was offering much more than astrological advice. In her book, she does ramble on about the planets and their positions. However, she also does just kind of like shoehorn in her personal opinion and acts like it is divinely informed. Joan wasn't just telling Nancy what days were going to be good or bad. She was telling her exactly how she wanted her to act. Now, this is just my opinion as someone who has read Quigley's entire book. I have no doubt in my mind that she believes in astrology. I also don't want to bash astrology as a concept. I have believed in similarly unsubstantiated things, and I'm really not here to judge anyone. I would also be lying if I said that if someone handed me an astrology column, you know, I would still read my own sign, like even though I don't personally believe in it. Astrology is also responsible for the smoothest thing I've ever done. Like I remember I was on a date one time and I noticed she was wearing an evil eye necklace. And for some reason, I thought it would be a good idea to say, you know, I have the ability to perfectly guess someone's star sign. And so she called bullshit on that, and for some reason I just looked at her and go, you're a Taurus. And she freaked out because despite only knowing a couple of star signs, I managed to guess correctly. And so I do have a kind of a soft spot for astrology because at least at one point in my life, it made me seem a lot cooler than I actually am. The reason I bring this up is because I personally believe that Joan Quigley is a charlatan who uses astrology to get closer to positions of power. Joan does this thing throughout her book where she tries to pass off her opinions as divinely informed. Like, I honestly can't tell if she does this on purpose or if she's just so confident in what she is saying is true that when she interprets these charts, she just reads it as supporting whatever she personally believes. Like, there is only one point in the entire book in which she kind of takes accountability for getting something wrong. And that was because it was a debate and she said she didn't have a complete version of the opponent's star chart. However, this is like a kind of just like an excuse. This shows that she doesn't view her methodology as flawed in any way, and that whenever something goes wrong, it's not the fault of astrology, it's the fault of, she wasn't provided the correct chart. Quigley is also just kind of like a nasty person. She's really mean to Nancy Reagan for just like no reason. She will often imply that Nancy is vain and stupid, and the only reason she's helping her is out of a sense of charity. She also just kind of like chucks in all of these like little jabs. Like at one point, she says that Nancy Reagan is totally innocent of history. And there's also another point in which she brings up some like ancient Greek literature and for some reason just decides to chuck in the comment that, oh, Nancy wouldn't understand this. Like, chill out, dude. Like, I think all of this just stems from an ego thing because Nancy wrote a memoir called My Turn in which she downplays Quigley's influence over the administration. And I think Quigley took this really personally and wanted to like set the record straight. She also does this thing throughout her book where she keeps on calling the Reagans broke, which is objectively not true. Like, she met Nancy Reagan when she was the wife of the governor of California, and then he became the president of the United States, arguably the most powerful man in the world at the time, and for some reason she kept on saying that they were unable to pay her fees. At the beginning of the book, she claims that she was hardly being paid at all, and instead it was more of her donating her expertise in service of her country. However, this was shown to be like objectively false by Quigley herself, because later in the book it reveals that the Reagans were paying her for like a whole month at a time, in which they were sending her around $3,000, which is roughly around 12,000 USD today. She loves playing the role of the martyr, and to show this, I will read you an excerpt from her book. I charged Nancy a monthly fixed fee because she needed much more of my time than she could afford. This was very generous on my part, because I often worked longer than full time. For a while, when an emergency would arise, I was working as long as 9 hours uninterrupted. I don't know why she put this bit in, because you're telling me that the most she ever worked during even periods like the Iran-Contra affair or the USSR negotiations was a 9 to 5? Like, I've worked for longer periods than that on this video, which I'm not even being paid for. However, I could be if you hit that like and subscribe button, because remember, if you don't, a great tragedy is going to befall you. And I'm sorry, I don't make the rules, I just read the charts, so do with that what you will. Self-shilling aside, Quigley was not helping the Reagans out of the goodness of her heart. She was very handsomely compensated for the little work she did do. Additionally, she was also compensated by gaining crazy amounts of political power. Over time, Quigley's influence over the Reagans grew significantly. Soon, pretty much all of the messages Quigley was telling Nancy were being relayed onto Ronald Reagan. Anytime the president would want to plan a meeting, he would relay it onto Nancy, who would then relay it onto Quigley, in which she would then provide an appropriate time for them to have it. Additionally, anytime Air Force One would take off or land, Quigley would have to set the times for it. It even got to the point in which if they arrived at their destination early, Air Force One would just like circle around the control tower until it reached the time Quigley had recommended. This confused the hell out of the White House staff because for some reason the president had a very bizarre schedule in which he would only plan his meetings at like 12:02 or 3:36, which just kind of made working around him like a nightmare. Soon, every major and minor decision was first ran by a random woman living in San Francisco. This even included medical appointments. Ronald Reagan got cancer in 1985, and the doctors wanted to operate immediately. However, Quigley insisted that they postpone the surgery by 3 days. This is what she had to say. I was definitely responsible for the delay between July 10 and July 13 of 1985. It was because of me that the operation was successful and that there was no reoccurrence of the cancer between July 1985 and President Reagan's departure from office. The 3-day delay was of no importance medically. Had they operated before the time I chose, they would have risked not removing the cancerous growth completely. The fact that the cancer did not reoccur is due to the excellent time I chose astrologically. She even states that afterwards, the surgeon looked as though he had aged 10 years. He told me he got through the unexpected difficulties almost miraculously. He said he couldn't have gone through it without my help. He was a first-rate surgeon and didn't scoff at using astrology. In my notes, I've just written for the segment, everyone claps, because this just reads like fan fiction. Like, I'm sure this surgeon who has just finished this grueling surgery in which he had to remove a tumor that was twice as large as expected was thinking, man, I'm so thankful for this random woman who managed to postpone this surgery despite it being urgent by 3 days. I'm so glad she's here. What a hero. Like, there's also a point in the book in which she claims that she knew Nancy Reagan was going to develop cancer and for some reason just didn't tell her, which is like such a dick move. This woman is paying you to predict when bad things are going to happen to her, and you're like, you know what? I'm just not going to tell her about the cancer because she'll worry. Like, no, like this is your literal job. Like, it's almost like she didn't actually predict she was going to get cancer, which I know might be heresy, right? But like, I'm starting to think that there's a non-zero chance that Joan Quigley isn't actually predicting anything and that she's just like taking credit for things after they happen. Nah, that can't be true. That's heresy. That's heresy. She's definitely predicting the future. Anyway, did you know that Joan Quigley ended the Cold War? Because according to her, she did. Like, she makes several references in her book to Reagan's speech about the USSR being an evil empire. She claimed that in order for the two countries to get along, he was going to have to drop this attitude. Which, like, I mean, she's not wrong. She states that after I briefed Nancy for Geneva, his evil empire attitude towards the Soviet Union changed with no other explanation. She also claimed that Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan had very, very similar astrological charts that predicted a fruitful friendship, and that she also claimed that he was a very reasonable man. She also encouraged Reagan to participate in the secret meeting between him and Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland. And even though no major agreement was made at this time, it did lay the groundwork for the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned all short and intermediate-ranged nuclear missiles. Look, it's very hard to know if what Quigley is saying is true, but even if she just like simply told Reagan that him and Gorbachev had very compatible star signs, like, I mean, it wouldn't hurt the diplomacy effort. So I guess in some way, no matter how small, Joan Quigley probably did contribute to the end of the Cold War, which I think is very funny. Something else I find is very funny is that Joan Quigley was such a huge liability to the safety of the president. Keep in mind, she was planning the exact time and location of his meetings, and she was relaying this to Nancy Reagan over an unsecured phone line. Additionally, she wasn't doing any of the computing of these charts herself. She was sending them off to a third-party computer company. She did claim that there was nothing identifiable on the documents that she sent over. I like to think that there's just like some random employee that's just like reading her documents that are just going like, this woman wants to know if Donald Reagan should have a 12:02 meeting in the Oval Office. Like, I'm really curious to know how she was encrypting these messages. It's also funny to think that Joan Quigley only kind of started working with the Reagans because Nancy Reagan was terrified of the president getting assassinated. And because of this, they just greatly increased his chance of getting assassinated by relaying his exact whereabouts at any given time over unsecured phone lines and then sending it off to third-party computer companies. The story of Joan Quigley and her influence over the Reagan family is very interesting. I also kind of like the idea that you don't have to be a member of some billionaire class to control a world superpower. You just need to have the ability to tell a convincing lie with, you know, completely unfounded confidence. And you too can rule a nation from the shadows. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm a small channel, so the fact that you stuck with me this far really does mean a lot. If you want, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. It really does go a long way. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.
We all are striving to be free. We're in harmony. This is the majesty